I'm the instructor of record for the class. And I wanted to give you some information because I've worked for a long time on an ethnographic project with Mexican families in Chicago and in their village in Michoacan. And you read my chapter last night, which kind of summed up background information on those families. And I thought I would give you, I have two parts to my presentation today. The first thing I want to do is give you a little more background information about the whole study, because what you got was more about the people and domains of their lives and their education, their language, their literacy, that kind of thing. I have some photos to show you because I think photos make it more real. And then what we're going to do is weave into my presentation. Siduri has some information for you about comparing the two school systems, Mexico and the United States. And then Helica is going to talk more in response to the questions that you guys posted after reading her beginning of her biography in our notes online last night. So then what I have in the second part, we'll see whether you're still awake or whether we need coffee. It's a little more academic, but Siduri assured me that you really are interested in issues like language ideologies and dialects and the history of Standard English. If you look at the history of Standard English, you find out it's not handed down by God. It didn't come to the top of the mountain from, via Moses. It has a history, right? There was a time when there was no Standard English. So I have material I drew from different presentations I give to my classes at Ohio State. And I thought, then at the end, I pull that together and try and talk about what does this mean for your situations or for students who come from migrant families. I hope we have time for all of that. Let's start. I love this. I started one of the chapters in my book with this. I listen to Spanish radio in Chicago because I'm afraid I'll lose my Spanish, but also I just like to, I don't know, it makes me feel like I'm back in Mexico. It makes me feel warm and fuzzy, and I spent enough time there that I feel like I came out half Mexican, But this is one of the most ranchero, Western Mexico, stations in Chicago, 107.9, 107.9. And this is a routine that they were doing all the time. It was in Spanish, but I put the English here. Oops, this isn't working. I have to do it here. No? Oh, well, technology fails. Oh, I'm pushing the wrong thing. No.
Should be the arrow on the right. Yeah.
There we go. They say, where are you somebody calls into the show. Where are you calling from? Chicago. Or they'll say Elgin, or wherever they live. Where are you from in Mexico? Michoacan. I say that because that's my favorite, but it's the most frequent answer also, which is very interesting. Bueno, in Chicago, Michoacan, ¿cuál manda? And the translation is, okay, and in Chicago, Michoacan, who rules, basically, who's in charge? It's like it's really interesting because it's wordplay, which Mexicans love to do all the time. Basically play around with language. And there's a lot going on here, but this strikes me as real transnational, Chicago, Michoacan. And that's why I called my book Rancheros in Chicagoacan, because it's really a transnational community over national boundaries, and it's close enough that they can go back. And of course, the play here about La Ley, that's the name of the radio station. And of course, the law, and the whole issues of whether you're documented or not, and who rules. Well, we rule, it's a very ranchero, self-assertive stance. So, and the end, I'm sorry, La Ley manda. Okay, our station's on top, basically, but it's like joking around with the whole situation. And here are some characteristics that make this a transnational community. There's frequent communication. When I first started with knowing these folks, it was more by letters, actually, and then gradually, as people did better, then they were on the phone, and now everybody's got cell phones, and they know which which packages you can get, so you can call Mexico cheaply, and And there's a lot of activity, Hella can maybe tell you about this, where people in Chicago organize urban planning projects for the Rancho. Now, Rancho is a very small, it translates like hamlet into English. It's like 400 people, basically. And it was originally a small agricultural community. But now what's happening is they made themselves a plaza. I don't know how much that cost in total, but it was a lot of money. But people are making money in Chicago and organizing committees in Chicago to create new paving the roads. And the government down there had a 2-for-1, I think, right? 3-for-1. You pay one part, they pay 3 parts or something like that, yeah. And so they're capitalizing on US dollars being sent home. A lot of people have homes in both places so that they have a place to stay. Not everybody, but when they go to the Rancho. The Rancho, when I first went there, I was just stunned to see so much Chicago all over the place. Sweatshirts, decals in windows. I mean, there was one I have a picture of a car sitting in the Rancho in the bright sunshine with snow on a little decal that said Chicago, you know, in the back window. And a lot of English print all over the place. Ashtrays, calendars, you know, clothing, that kind of thing. Conversely, if you go to Mexican neighborhoods in Chicago, it's different from here. It's more spread out here. But there you walk down the street and you feel like, oh, I'm in Guadalajara. You know, you hear Mexican music, people are crossing as they pass the churches that have the shrines to the Virgin, Mexican food. I mean, it's really very Mexican, yeah.
Is there like a sign to let you know that you're entering like the community, like in Chicago,
Sometimes.
like Chinatown, they have the big...
Yeah, sometimes, yeah, there's one in La Villita, yeah, little village, yeah, La Villita. So, and you can go from, this is just the way Chicago is, but you can go 2 blocks and suddenly you're from a Mexican ambiance into Chinatown. I mean, it's like everything's different, you know. So, here's the drive from Chicago to the Rancho. And so you can see, this is Michoacan here in orange, and the Rancho's up here in northwest Michoacan. We got made fun of, my husband and I, when we drove down there because we stayed in motels, you know, for 3 nights. And they said, you know, we go straight through, you know, 45 hours. Okay, so it's in northwestern Michoacan. The municipio, that's like a county sort of Tinguindín is 10,000 people, but half the people are in Tinguindín, the city, so the others are in the little ranchos around. The Rancho, at last count, was 400. This area is very interesting because when I went down there, I had read literature about anthropological studies of communities down there, and nobody talked about the fact that there were non-Indian communities. And I kept feeling like this isn't matching. When I was in the Rancho and with people, I thought, this doesn't fit what I'm reading in the literature. I don't understand this, you know? And I finally figured out, after living down there, I realized of some communities, everybody says, well, yeah, that's indigenous. And this is ranchero. That's indigenous. This is ranchero. So, I mean, like the identities are extremely separate. Even though over the centuries, people have passed over those boundaries, but the identities are still quite separate. So, and I'll explain more about that later. I think what's going on here, however, is that researchers have romanticized the Indian, including anthropologists, of which I'm one. But so whenever they want to study a community, they want to study the most quote-unquote authentic. Well, who's the most authentic in Mexico? Well, the Indians. You know, that's sort of like an unconscious assumption. So I found out that there are, I'll give you the history here in a bit, but there's a history of why some of these communities are indigenous or used to be indigenous and are now mestizo versus other communities that used to be Spanish settlements and then gradually became mestizo. So you have 2 different kinds of mestizo communities, basically. This I love because you can see the microregion, This is the Rancho right where and this is not an accident, the railroad crosses the road, right there. This is Tinguindin, the township center. This is Zamora, which is a bigger city, Zamora Hakona, where I had a Fulbright. And then up here in the mountains is more the Indian villages here, Tarascan speaking. This over here was a well-known Spanish settlement, okay, to the west. What happened is the indigenous got pushed up the mountains, basically, as the Spaniards took over. So in the Sierra, you have more Tarascan villages. West of the Sierra, there was a Spanish settlement in the 1700s. They set up cattle ranches and a few haciendas. This was not a big hacienda region because the elite Spaniards who owned the big haciendas wanted flat land, right? So they could make a lot of money. So there were less elite Spaniards who didn't get the best picks, right? The miners, the sailors, the farmers. They got these little areas that were kind of hilly and near the mountains, and that's where the Rancho is today. So it was described in 1800 as an island of Spaniards and mulattoes, and there's African heritage here too, which is very interesting because that's not talked about a lot in Mexico. Surrounded by Tarascos. That's what they say in Spanish. In the Indian language, they call themselves Purépecha. So I guess I'm using the English word here based on the Spanish. But so you still have, in 2011, distinct identities and villages. This is a topographic map. My husband helps me with all these, with all the statistics and the images, and this was really fun. So you can see these are the mountains. Here's the Rancho. It's like a little plain in between all the mountains. This is where the less elite Spaniards got to grab land, basically. And so this really is a visual that gives you that picture.
What was the terrain like driving there? I mean, could you just follow a normal map, or did you have to go? There were
MapQuest. I don't know. I haven't done that. But
I mean, like, because I've been to some areas of Mexico where there aren't paved roads or.
well, this Rancho has a paved road right by it,
Okay.
and it has since when did that go in? The 50s, 60s, something like that. Yeah. So it's further along the migration path than some other ranchos. Now, Helic is married to a guy, and I went to his rancho too, which is in Guanajuato, and that was like ba-boom, ba-boom, for 45 minutes on a dirt road to get to that rancho. So, you know, but this one's relatively close to the highway. Okay, so this is where the rancho is set. Small hilly plain on the edge of the mountain, 1,700 meters is really lovely. It's really beautiful. It was subsistence farming and cattle raising, but with dollars in Chicago, they bought land. First one family, then another, and everybody bought land as an investment, and now they're raising avocados. So now they're commercial agriculture. So they transformed their own economy with money from Chicago. And that's unusual in the development literature, I find out, because lots of people use money for health, education, building houses, building bathrooms, so that you can have an indoor bathroom, all these things, and that's how the money gets used up. But these folks put some money aside to invest in the future. So the current economy is commercial agriculture. In the 90s, 9 packing plants located there. So now people can have wage labor, which is not great, but it pays pretty well. There's no gender differential, I found out. And they're close to home, so for women, it's not seen as going off into the big bad city. So it has changed gender relations too, the fact that women can work, and there's these issues about, well, what are they going to do with their money, even though what they do with the money is usually buy food for the family, you know, or buy things for the family. But that's another topic. Okay, here's the Rancho, and this is an old map, which we pieced together from electronic photos, but it doesn't have the plaza which they built. Here's the capilla. This is where they built the plaza. But as you can see, it's not a planned Mexican town. Ranchos are not like little towns in Mexico where there's always a Zocalo, a Central Park, you know, and you always have the church there and the administration and stuff. Ranchos are rural settlements, and so they throw up houses wherever their fields are, historically. So, but they have two little schools that came there, Kinder and Primaria, came in the 50s or 60s. There was a teacher in the Rancho in the 40s. I think I said this in my chapter, though. So, oh, the soccer field, very important. Now, to shift to Chicago, just to give you a little background. Mexican experience, according to a lot of scholars, in the Midwest is very different from the Mexican experience in the Southwest. And that's because the Southwest used to be part of Mexico. Huge part of the Southwest. And it was taken from Mexico at the end of the Mexican-American War, Treaty of Hidalgo, 1848. And like the Canadians in the Quebecois in Canada, you know, their license plates say, Je me souviens, I remember. They are still remembering the injustices they have suffered, the French in Canada. Mexicans always remember that that used to be Mexico. I mean, I've had your father say that to me, you know. So Chicago never was. So it's like this more neutral place, which is also heavily immigrant. Chicago is heavily, heavily immigrant. So Mexicans followed Eastern European immigrants into neighborhoods, historically, and jobs. Because the Eastern Europeans were cut off from immigrating during the First World War and after, because of everything that was going on. They just cut off immigration, and all these factories, steel factories and stuff, said, what are we going to do? They recruited. They recruited Mexicans, they recruited Appalachian whites, and they recruited African Americans, the latter two groups from the South. So that's that big migration north. But they also recruited Mexicans. So you had Mexicans, Appalachian whites, and African Americans working in the steel mills to keep things going because they cut off all the Eastern European migration. Very interesting. And Chicago has a rich history, particularly African American and Mexican. I don't know that anybody's done too much on the Appalachians, but it would be interesting. So if Mexicans come to Chicago, it's not like there's a history that this is Texas. I mean, Texas has a very different, terrible, caste-like history. I'll just say it out, you know. I feel different, you know, when I go to Texas. You can just feel it. Also, Chicago has white diversity. So people aren't so much white. I mean, they're white, but they'll say to you, and when I first moved there, they would say, what are you? And I'd say, excuse me? I mean, I wasn't used to being asked, what are you? I thought they said, who are you? You know? So they want to know, no, are you Lithuanian? Are you Polish? Are you Irish? Are you, you know? So they have this very strong sense of being something. And that's why I think there's also a large presence of African Americans, which you don't have as proportionately in the Southwest. I think because of all this is why you see more intermarriage. I mean, I don't know statistically if there's more, but I've noticed there's traditionally been marriage from Mexicans with Poles, for example. And your cousin married a Polish boy. So the wedding, the mass at the wedding was amazing. It was in 3 languages. It was forever long, but it was really lovely. Okay. So they were recruited, railroad, meatpacking, steel industries. Pretty much, I mean, there was some migration north when the Mexican Revolution started in 1910, but pretty much the 20s is when it was big recruitment. There were 3 original neighborhoods close to where they worked. Their neighbors were European immigrants, especially in one neighborhood. The European immigrants were Catholic, like Mexicans. So there were lots of intermarriages, particularly in one neighborhood. And they came together in the labor unions also. So there were whites, blacks, Mexicans, everybody in the labor union. So there was more interaction and intermarriage. The first so-called Hispanic police chief in Chicago did not speak Spanish, he spoke Polish, because his mother was Polish, but his father was Rodriguez, you know, so. History of migration, 1916, 1929, horrible things happened during the Depression. People were repatriated. Children who were born in Chicago were repatriated to Mexico. They were US citizens, right? Some people wanted to go back, but other people were forcibly repatriated. But then again, once again, the United States says, whoops, we need people. So they started another Bracero program, 42, I think, or 44 maybe, to 64. The Puerto Ricans were recruited also and started coming in the 50s. Cubans came after the Castro takeover. Other Latin Americans, there's like 200 Guatemalans, you know, so it's interesting to have all these different things going on. But Chicago being Chicago, I guess, they're pretty separate. I mean, even the Mexicans and Puerto Ricans don't live together, you know, so certain neighborhoods are Puerto Rican, other neighborhoods are Mexican. I don't know, the Cubans and Latin Americans tend to live on the north side. You know, it's not entirely that case, but largely. I do have a colleague who's writing about Mexicans, people who have married across, you know, Puerto Ricans and Mexicans who have married, and what their children are like and what their identity is like. This shows very simple compared to what Victor showed you on Monday, but I thought it was interesting that it pretty much takes off there. And this is because, not just because of the recruitment, but because it becomes, a lot of researchers have shown that when ranchos start into the migration process, it then becomes a rite of passage for boys when they get to a certain age to, as your father said to one of his nephews, vete a la frontera, muchacho. Get yourself to the border, boy. He meant get to work, you know. And
you said when they come to a certain age, what would that age be?
17 maybe, you think? This particular guy is one of her cousins, and Ramon. He's got freckles, reddish brown, light hair, blue eyes, you know, very pale skin, crossed the border, and they were ignoring him until they spoke to him, and he couldn't answer them in English. Then they said, wait a minute, are you Mexican? Caught him, sent him home. So, so he finished his education there, and he's working there, and everybody's happy, but.
What is that CMSA? What is that?
Chicago Metropolitan Statistical, you know, I had to count county by county to get an accurate count over time because it changes, you know. So eventually you have to count, I had to count Indiana counties and Wisconsin counties because all around the lake, if you remember, Victor had a slide that showed you that, was heavily Latino, Mexican. So the main neighborhoods are on the south and southwest side where Mexicans live. Pilsen was a traditional port of entry. It's called Pilsen because the Bohemians were there first. I'm sorry. Directly west of Pilsen is a little neighborhood called La Villita, or Little Village. West of that is Berwyn, Cicero. I mean, it's all Mexican now. These are the numbers that people in Helica's family live in. There are some north side community areas with other Spanish-speaking populations because as the Mexican population increased, they began to settle in other Spanish-speaking neighborhoods and other non-Spanish-speaking neighborhoods too. Where I live in Evanston, which is the first suburb on the north, it's a very urban suburb. There are Mexicans and they're all from Guanajuato. It's interesting. So. But generally speaking, they do not move into African-American neighborhoods. And there isn't as much interaction, I don't think, between those two populations, except on the south side where the populations live closer together. So it depends on demographics a lot. Here's a map of Chicago which is famous for its mosaic of ethnic neighborhoods. But this started in the 20s when people at the University of Chicago divided up Chicago into community areas and started outreach studies and so forth. So here's Pilsen, little village, and then people, as they did better, bought houses, moved south. This may be Gage Park, I'm not sure. Maybe one of these is Gage Park. This is the old neighborhood on the south side where there's more of a mix of population, I think. Somebody have a question? No. This is number of Mexicans from the census 2000.
All of that Chicago?
Yes. This is the city of Chicago. It seems big to you? Yeah.
Now that's that separate section down there, I think it's number 52.
Yeah.
Is that area now primarily African American?
52, no, this is, this has more African Americans, but one of my graduate students did a dissertation on the high school kids here, and this high school was half African American and half Mexican. And one of the interesting things that she said to me, I'd never forget, she said that one of the teachers, one of the African American teachers said to her, in referring to the Mexican kids, you know, the white kids. And I said, she said, white? She said, yeah. You know, it was like, if you're not black, you have to be white. So it's this dichotomy we have, you know, and Mexicans kind of disrupt that dichotomy. Isn't that interesting, though? That was her perception. And I understand from some of the younger kids that there's more picking up by Mexicans of African American language and style and so forth there because they're interacting more, right? Whereas here, they're moving in where Poles were and Bohemians and so forth. The only thing I don't like about this map is it doesn't tell you where everybody else is, but I could never find a map that did that. The historical African American community, you may know, though, is on the south side, and it's got a very rich history. So, yeah, this is the north side, this is the south side. This is the Sox, that's the Cubs. Okay, so here's my study to explain. Helica's father, actually, came to Chicago. He was the first one to come to Chicago from the Rancho. He had an uncle who had been there before, from Tinguindin. But he was the first one to really start this migration, and he came as a bracero. He was recruited. But then he came back because the need for the money to support the family back in Mexico was still there, even though the bracero program ended. I met them all in 1989. We helped them with the IRCA documentation, you know, to sort of give back. They were agreeing to help us with our research. So we helped them get through the process, those who needed it, those who didn't already have papers. This is a term from the literature, dense and multiplex social network. That means that people who, and it's typical of immigrant communities all over the world, that people who socialize together also live together. So your friendship networks, your kinship networks, your work networks are all the same people. So it makes it easier when you're a researcher, right? So, whereas as people become more, well, as people become more middle class, they begin to have separate networks. So kids go to college and they begin to have these college friends, and then the family friends, and then the neighborhood, and you know, so it's less dense. The kind of research we did was meant to be long-term participant observation. That means that you don't just observe people like an uninterested observer, but you have to participate, because how else are you going to understand their point of view? And the whole point of this research is to get the other perspectives other than your own. So this began a very interesting period in my life where, you know, I didn't stop to think that as I learned all these things, and as I sort of, when I lived in Mexico, I just sort of threw myself into it. I thought, I want to acculturate and see how it feels, that it would change me, you know? I hadn't thought about that. But it did. I really feel very different now than I did when I started the project. And I'm told when I speak Spanish I have a little bit different personality. So we did a lot of audio taping with their permission. And we did a lot of collaborative work, like they taped when I wasn't there. And I hired various people to work. When I got grants, I thought, well, I have money. I can hire people to help me in my office. So they transcribed tapes for me and things. And one day I walked in the office and they were making me a map. It was great. They were drawing a map on a big huge sheet of paper of the Rancho. I don't know if you were there that day, but I remember your sister standing there drawing in little cars and stuff. You know, and who lived in which house and everything. It was wonderful. Okay, I'm going to skip from here because I don't want to go into this for this presentation. This is sort of what I covered in my book, how they talk, how they use language to express their identities. I'd be glad to talk to you about that sometime, but we wouldn't have time to go through all this and some other material I have. So I'm going to stop here